In the waning, rust-colored days of October 1977, the Cold War was not a hot conflict, but a perpetual, agonizing symphony of electronic whispers and calculated silence. The air, thick with the tension of two superpowers locked in an ideological and technological death grip, hummed with the constant monitoring of NATO's vast early warning radar network. It was a digital curtain drawn across the sky, meant to detect the first sign of the unthinkable, a Soviet missile launch. But on one ordinary Tuesday, in the labyrinthine command centers scattered from the chilly moorlands of RAF Fillingdales in Yorkshire to the subterranean bunkers of NORAD deep inside Cheyenne Mountain, a new sound began to mix with the static. It was a pulse. It appeared first as a spectral artifact on the AN/FPS-46 Ballistic Missile Early Warning System (BMEWS) scopes, a faint, almost dismissible blip amidst the clutter of civilian air traffic, weather phenomena, and the ever-present, jagged noise of the ionosphere. It was the electronic equivalent of a lone, distant drumbeat. Initially, it was categorized as an anomaly. The default setting in the Cold War electronic theater was always skepticism. Analysts, men who lived and breathed radio frequencies, their eyes perpetually strained by the green phosphorescence of radar screens, had seen everything: flocks of migrating birds mistaken for an entire bomber wing, spurious signals bouncing off the aurora borealis, even equipment malfunctions caused by a simple power surge. "Just another ghost," muttered a weary wing commander at Fillingdales, gesturing toward the transient spot. It was too regular, too deliberate, yet too weak to be a genuine threat. It didn't fit the profile of a strategic bomber, a submarine-launched missile, or even a deep-penetration surveillance aircraft. It was an orphan signal. The immediate, dismissive assumption was Soviet maskirovka, their notorious art of military deception. The Soviets were masters of electronic warfare, known for deploying sophisticated jammers and decoys to muddy NATO's sensors. Perhaps this was a new attempt to test the network's sensitivity, a calculated effort to force analysts to chase shadows and waste resources. The pulse simply didn't match anything catalogued in the extensive American or European electronic warfare libraries, those massive, meticulously cross-referenced tomes detailing every known Soviet radar, telemetry link, and guidance system. Every known system, that is. The pulse had a unique energy signature and a frequency modulation pattern that defied easy classification. It wasn't the high-power, broadband blast of an over-the-horizon (OTH) radar designed to cook an incoming missile with sheer energy. Nor was it the sharp, clean ping of a dedicated tracking system. It was something in between, a smooth, almost elegant, low-frequency throb. And then, the impossible happened. It happened again, and again. The initial dismissal curdled into uneasy fixation. The signal wasn't random, it was metronomic. The 62-second rhythm. Across the vast geographical span of NATO's listening posts, from the North Atlantic to the Mediterranean, the pattern began to assert itself with chilling predictability. The pulse arrived, disappeared, and then, after an interval that was measured not in fractions of a second, but in a complete, agonizing minute, it returned. Each pulse came exactly 62 seconds apart. This precise periodicity was the first clue that this was not natural, it was engineered. Nature is chaotic. This was a timepiece crafted by men. But it was the characteristics of the pulse itself, its sheer power output relative to its frequency, and the way it propagated, that began to truly terrify the technical teams. The signal's energy signature suggested a ground-based emitter, a colossal radar array perhaps, rooted in the Soviet mainland. Yet, its received strength at NATO stations defied the laws of physics as understood in conventional radio propagation. To understand the magnitude of this problem, one must understand the radio horizon. On Earth, radio waves generally travel in straight lines, or are limited by refraction in the lower atmosphere. For a ground-based transmitter, its signal is literally blocked by the curvature of the Earth at a certain distance. The atmosphere might bend the signal slightly, but there are hard limits. This phenomenon is known as the line of sight barrier. The signal NATO was tracking was coming from an apparent distance far exceeding this theoretical radio horizon. The signal was behaving like a transmission from a source hundreds, perhaps even thousands, of miles away, bypassing the curvature of the planet as if the Earth itself were flat. The energy required for a conventional ground-based radar to achieve this would be astronomical, enough to trip circuit breakers across a small republic, and its side effects, massive electromagnetic interference, would have been impossible to miss. A young radar technician named David Allister, stationed at RAF Fillingdales, a site known for its distinctive, golf ball-like radomes, was one of the first to log the pulse with meticulous, unsettling detail. Allister was a product of the Cold War's demanding technological arms race, a man who trusted his instruments more than his superiors. In his handwritten logbook, under the flickering fluorescent light of the operations room, he scrawled the analysis that would later be deemed prophetic. Source unknown. Range impossible. Behaving like a horizon-breaking object, except no object could survive those conditions. The horizon-breaking object he referred to was the conceptual idea of a satellite or a high-altitude aircraft, which could transmit over the curvature of the Earth. But the physics of the pulse, its frequency and modulation, were characteristic of a massive, fixed, ground-based antenna system. Allister's superior, a man preoccupied with the daily grind of filtering out false alarms, paid the note no mind. A simple, dismissive line was written in blue ink next to Allister's observation: atmospheric ducting anomaly. Check maintenance logs for R-band drift. Not yet. No one in the upper echelons of NATO intelligence grasped the gravity of the 62-second rhythm. They were looking for an ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile, a Tu-95 Bear bomber, or a nuclear submarine. They were not prepared for a device that seemed to rewrite the rules of electronic warfare. Because NATO scientists and military intelligence officers would soon discover that this signal was, definitively, coming from a Soviet device, one so advanced, so technologically audacious, so far beyond what Western intelligence believed the USSR was capable of, that the only rational conclusion, initially, was that the entire exercise was a hoax. They would be profoundly, and dangerously, wrong. The true origin of the impossible signal was rooted deep within the Soviet Union's paranoia, that was well justified. The Soviet military leadership, the Stavka, was obsessed with a single, terrifying vulnerability: the opening seconds of a U.S. first strike. Specifically, their dread focused on the Minuteman III silos and, even more critically, the submarine-launched ballistic missiles (SLBMs) fired from Polaris and Poseidon submarines lurking silently in the North Atlantic. But above all, they feared the B-52 Stratofortress, the massive, globe-trotting strategic bomber. The B-52, in the Soviet mind, was not merely a delivery system, it was a psychological weapon. Equipped with advanced electronic countermeasures and capable of carrying waves of air-launched cruise missiles (ALCMs), the B-52 represented the slow, inevitable approach of devastation. They flew high, fast, and often on an ambiguous route that kept Soviet air defense commanders perpetually guessing. To detect the launch of a missile, the Soviets had the Duga network, massive, power-hungry over-the-horizon (OTH) radars designed to see over the horizon by bouncing signals off the ionosphere. These were notorious for their interference, earning the nickname woodpecker for their incessant, rapid-fire tap-taps on shortwave radio bands worldwide. But the woodpecker, while a brute force system, was not precise enough for target acquisition against a maneuvering bomber. The Soviets needed something better, something that could lock onto a low-flying, radar-evading object with high resolution, not just detect a massive missile launch. In the secluded, highly guarded Moscow Institute of Thermal Engineering (MIT), where the USSR cooked up its most exotic military hardware, a team of brilliant but often under-resourced engineers, led by the enigmatic academician Pyotr F. Smirnov, was given a single, impossible directive from the Kremlin. Develop a system that can see low-flying aircraft over the horizon with the clarity of line-of-sight radar, using energy levels a fraction of the Duga. Smirnov was not a radar man. He was a plasma physicist with a radical, almost heretical, idea. He theorized that instead of relying on the unpredictable, atmospheric bouncing of standard high-frequency HF/OTH radar, they could exploit the subtle, yet powerful, interaction between very low-frequency radio waves and the planet's magnetosphere. Radio waves, especially those in the very low-frequency VLF and extremely low-frequency ELF range, the frequencies used to communicate with deep-diving submarines, do not stop at the horizon. They follow the curvature of the Earth, propagating within the Earth ionosphere waveguide. The problem was that the long wavelengths required for this type of propagation meant the radar's resolution would be disastrously poor. It would be like trying to read a newspaper with a telescope designed for looking at the moon. You'd know something was there, but you couldn't identify a single letter. Smirnov's breakthrough involved a principle that Western physicists had long considered theoretically interesting but practically impossible: nonlinear magnetospheric resonance. The concept was simple yet terrifying. Instead of a single massive pulse, the system would emit a series of precisely timed, low-power pulses. The pulses were spaced exactly 62 seconds apart. This interval was no accident. It corresponded to a calculated resonant frequency within the Earth's natural electromagnetic environment. The first pulse would act as a preconditioner, subtly exciting the ionospheric plasma at a specific point thousands of miles away. The 62-second delay allowed the disturbed plasma to reach a momentary, semi-stable state. The second pulse, which was infinitesimally weaker, would then exploit this preconditioned plasma state, causing a nonlinear interaction that effectively amplified the return signal by orders of magnitude. In essence, the Earth's own magnetosphere became the Soviet Union's main radar amplifier. They weren't fighting the horizon, they were using the entire planet as their antenna. The project was code-named Medvedi Kazayeva, the Bear Hunter. The construction of the Bear Hunter was a masterwork of Soviet logistical prowess and Stalinist secrecy. The site chosen was in the arid, desolate heart of the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic, a region selected for its excellent ground conductivity and its distance from prying Western eyes. Known officially as Scientific Research Complex 44B, the facility was a city unto itself, guarded by a triple cordon of KGB special troops. The main component was not a dish, but a gargantuan horizontal dipole antenna array, literally, mile upon mile of buried copper cable stretching across the steppe like a hidden circulatory system. This was necessary to efficiently launch the extremely long wavelength VLF/ELF pulses into the Earth ionosphere waveguide. The heart of the system, the pulse generator, was a technological marvel, a collection of massive, custom-built Marx generators designed to release a controlled, shaped electromagnetic wave with unprecedented precision. The entire complex required the dedicated output of a small nuclear power plant to handle the incredible, instantaneous power draw of each 62-second pulse. The human element of the project was just as extraordinary. The chief engineer, a man known only by the patronymic Ivanovich, was a brilliant, apolitical theoretician who saw the project as a pure exercise in physics, not a tool of war. He meticulously calibrated the system to hit the 62-second resonance window, a variable that changed slightly depending on the solar cycle, atmospheric density, and the season. "We are not sending a hammer blow, Comrade Major," Ivanovich once explained to the project's rigid political officer. "We are tuning a cosmic piano, and 62 seconds is the perfect interval for our C note." The initial tests of the Bear Hunter were disastrous. The early pulses were uncontrolled, leading to massive, localized electromagnetic interference (EMI). Local collective farms reported entire flocks of poultry dropping dead at the exact moment of a pulse, and the magnetic compasses of passing airliners would spin wildly. But Ivanovich persisted. Through 2 years of intense, grueling work, he and his team refined the pulse-shaping algorithms. They learned to compress the incredible energy burst into a smooth, logarithmically damped sine wave, a pulse that was powerful enough to condition the magnetosphere, yet subtle enough to avoid frying its own circuits or causing massive, immediate global alarm. The official operational date was set for September 1977. When the first successful, controlled pulse was transmitted, the telemetry from the remote monitoring stations was euphoric. The signal had traveled over 3,000 miles, utilizing the Earth ionosphere waveguide for maximum range, and the return echo, the reflection off a simulated B-52-sized target they'd placed in the remote Siberian wilderness, was clear, distinct, and high resolution. The Bear Hunter worked. It was capable of detecting the relatively small, low-flying radar cross-section of a B-52 carrying ALCMs at extreme range, seeing over the horizon with line-of-sight clarity, a feat that had previously been considered a fundamental violation of physics. The autumn of 1977 witnessed the first, unsettling breach in the electronic defenses of the West, the appearance of Pulse 62. This was the faint, yet maddeningly persistent, electronic throb on NATO's early warning radar scopes. Its 62-second rhythm and its impossible range, defying the physical constraints of the Earth's curvature, had been traced to the colossal, secret Soviet Bear Hunter complex in the Kazakh steppe. It was a technological declaration that Moscow had found a way to use the planet's own magnetosphere as a giant radar amplifier, capable of tracking NATO's strategic bombers over the horizon. Yet, as NATO scrambled to contain the threat of the bear hunter through the frantic countermeasures of Project Goliath, seeking to blind the Soviet radar by disrupting the ionosphere, a second, entirely separate mystery began to unfold, far to the north, in the desolate, star-dusted realm of the Arctic Circle. This new anomaly, less a pulse of raw power and more a whisper of heat, suggested a physical threat, not merely an electronic one. The modern Cold War battlefield was not fought with bayonets and trenches, it was fought in the sterile, air-conditioned rooms where human beings stared into the digital void. The eyes of the West were the American network of geostationary surveillance satellites, the Keyhole series and the early versions of the DSP Defense Support Program. These platforms were primarily designed to stare down at the Soviet Union, searching for the telltale heat bloom of a missile launch. In late 1977, as the Pulse 62 continued its rhythmic intrusion, the high-resolution, infrared sensors of a Keyhole 9 satellite, designated Hexagon, picked up something they shouldn't have. The anomaly was first logged by a junior analyst at the National Reconnaissance Office (NRO) facility in Fort Meade, Maryland. It was a shadow, a fleeting thermal signature that was registered not by its blazing heat, but by its peculiar lack of one. It was a faint heat anomaly, a smear of warmth just above the ambient background temperature of the atmosphere, drifting in a path that made no sense. The location was crucial, drifting above the Arctic Circle, following a complex, shallow elliptical path that hugged the upper reaches of the atmosphere. The analysts initially cycled through the standard explanations. A natural phenomenon. Solar flares, extreme weather, a peculiar refraction of light on high-altitude ice crystals. Dismissed. The thermal signature was too contained, too definite. A new U.S. system. Perhaps a classified test of a high-altitude drone or a next-generation stealth aircraft. Dismissed. All classified flight plans were cross-referenced and cleared. Standard Soviet reconnaissance. The MiG-25R Foxbat, or a high-altitude balloon carrying cameras. Dismissed. The object was moving too slowly for a jet and too high for a balloon, and its path defied standard aerodynamic profiles. The object was moving at an altitude of approximately 70,000 to 80,000 feet, 21 to 24 kilometers, a brutal, thin layer of the atmosphere known to aviators as the coffin corner. This zone is too high for conventional jet engines to operate efficiently and too low to achieve stable orbital velocity. But the most striking aspect was its trajectory. It was not a fixed orbit like a satellite. It was not a ballistic arc like a missile. It was tracking a meandering, polar route that seemed to be actively maintaining its altitude against the constant downward pull of gravity and the drag of the thin air. Furthermore, the object was exhibiting subtle yaw and pitch corrections, small, deliberate movements indicative of active guidance. It wasn't an aircraft. It wasn't a balloon. It wasn't a satellite. It was something in between. The analysts, working in a state of growing intellectual terror, assigned it a designation, UAV 2000. But among themselves, in the hushed, low-lit rooms of the NRO, they gave it a far more evocative nickname. The Ghost Platform. The technical specifications of the Ghost Platform led the CIA's most esoteric division, the Directorate of Science and Technology, on a deep dive into the most obscure, often deliberately misleading, Soviet technological archives. They were searching for a blueprint, a piece of theoretical physics that could explain how a large, heavy object could sustain flight at near-orbital altitudes for what appeared to be an unlimited duration. The breakthrough, ironically, came from the sheer incompetence of the Soviet bureaucracy. A newly recruited defector from the Soviet Ministry of Aviation Industry mentioned a disastrous, over-budgeted, and ultimately forgotten project from the early 1960s, a time of Khrushchev's frenzied, often impulsive, embrace of technological leaps. The project was officially titled Projekt Meteor, Project Meteor. The intelligence community, having meticulously tracked Soviet aerospace projects for decades, had long since catalogued and then dismissed Project Meteor. The conventional Western analysis, recorded in dusty, classified reports from 1964, concluded that the project was a victim of classic Soviet flaws, engineering failures, catastrophic material stress, and eventual budget starvation after the Cuban Missile Crisis forced a strategic reprioritization. The basic premise of Project Meteor, as detailed in the few available scraps of defector information and theoretical papers, was so radical that Western experts believed it belonged in a science fiction novel. The Soviet attempt to create a perpetual flight aircraft that could orbit the planet without ever entering space. The ambition was not merely to build a better spy plane, it was to defy the most fundamental limitation of aviation, the need for fuel. The visionaries behind Project Meteor, led by the brilliant but politically marginalized engineer Dr. Anatoly P. Zhuravlev, saw the upper atmosphere not as a barrier, but as a vast, untapped energy resource. The machine that Zhuravlev proposed wouldn't need fuel. It wouldn't need landing. It wouldn't even need a crew, a crucial, life-saving design element given the punishing radiation and pressure extremes of the upper stratosphere. The ultimate goal of the Meteor was simple, terrifying, and strategically brilliant. A reconnaissance platform that could loiter above U.S. territory for months, capturing photographic and electronic intelligence on a perpetual basis. A nuclear command relay that could guarantee communications with submerged submarine fleets or deep-buried missile silos, impervious to jamming or traditional attack. A stealth carrier for first-strike missiles, loitering at the very edge of the atmosphere, it could launch hypersonic glider vehicles at virtually zero warning, descending upon targets with impossible speed. The problem, as Western analysts had correctly assessed in the 1960s, was the physics. How do you power a heavy platform indefinitely at 80,000 feet, where the air is too thin for conventional propellers or jets, and the object is too heavy and too slow for conventional orbital mechanics? The answer, buried deep in Dr. Zhuravlev's original 1962 theoretical thesis, was the application of two highly exotic and then unproven technologies, magnetohydrodynamic (MHD) propulsion and atmospheric plasma tapping. The analysis teams at the CIA and Defense Intelligence Agency (DIA), linking the thermal shadow of the Ghost platform to the blueprints of Project Meteor, began to understand the true nature of the device. Magnetohydrodynamic (MHD) propulsion. The key to Meteor was the elimination of moving parts for propulsion. Conventional jet engines consume vast amounts of fuel and require thick air. MHD propulsion, by contrast, operates by accelerating an ionized gas plasma using a powerful electromagnetic field rather than a fan blade. The principle: air is sucked into the front of the vehicle. It is then intensely ionized using a concentrated radio frequency (RF) field, turning the normal air into a superheated, conductive plasma. Powerful superconducting magnets positioned along the fuselage then exert a force on this electrically charged plasma, accelerating it out the rear of the craft. The problem: while MHD offered the promise of incredibly high speeds and silent operation, it was a massive power sink. Generating the superconducting magnetic field and the RF ionization field required an unprecedented source of onboard power, far beyond what conventional batteries or fuel cells could provide. Atmospheric plasma tapping, the power source. This was Dr. Zhuravlev's genuine, terrifying stroke of genius, and the element the West believed was impossible. It provided the answer to the MHD power problem. At the altitude of 80,000 feet, the platform was positioned perfectly to interact with the D and E layers of the ionosphere, regions of the atmosphere that are naturally charged by solar radiation and cosmic rays. Zhuravlev theorized that if the vehicle could generate an extremely powerful, localized electrostatic field, it could create a virtual funnel, tapping into the flow of free-floating plasma energy and converting it into electrical power on the fly. The Ghost platform was essentially a vast, high-altitude battery charger flying through a charged cloud. This explained the anomalous thermal signature detected by the Keyhole satellite. The faint heat anomaly wasn't engine exhaust, it was the byproduct of the energy conversion process, the residual heat generated by the massive onboard superconducting systems and the plasma taps. "It's not flying on fuel, Colonel," explained a shaken DIA physicist during a classified briefing. "It's harvesting." The Soviets built a perpetual motion machine in the atmosphere. With the theoretical underpinnings established, the intelligence analysts pieced together the likely physical configuration of the Ghost platform. It was not the sleek, aerodynamic shape of a supersonic bomber. It had to be a design optimized for the silent, continuous operation of its exotic systems. The intelligence model suggested a vast, highly specialized structure. Shape and size: not a traditional aircraft, but a massive, blunted delta wing or a lenticular, disc body, perhaps up to 200 feet, 60 meters, in diameter. This large surface area was needed to house the extensive array of superconducting magnets necessary for MHD propulsion and to provide a stable platform for the plasma tapping antennae. Propulsion: the MHD thrusters would be located along the trailing edges of the wing, sucking in thin air and silently accelerating the ionized plasma. This explained the Ghost platform's eerie silence and its ability to maintain high altitude with minimal apparent effort. The skin, crucially, the external skin had to be a radical departure from conventional metals. It required an extremely advanced, non-conductive, ceramics-based composite to insulate the massive electrostatic and magnetic fields from the sensitive internal electronics. This material was likely responsible for the vehicle's surprisingly low radar cross-section, a characteristic that had initially led analysts to mistake it for a weather balloon. The internal systems were the most frightening. The onboard reactor. While the primary power was derived from the atmosphere, the initial launch and the maintenance of the superconducting magnets required a massive, instantaneous power boost. The intelligence consensus was that the Ghost platform likely housed a small, highly shielded thermoelectric isotope generator, RTG, or a tiny, closed-cycle nuclear reactor, giving it the capacity for immediate thrust adjustments or emergency maneuvers. The payload. The vast, stable interior of the disc-shaped craft was designed to house multiple payloads, high-resolution optical cameras capable of peering down through atmospheric haze, signals intelligence arrays to scoop up all forms of electronic communication, and, most chillingly, 8 to 12 launch tubes designed for smaller, hypersonic glide vehicles. The analysis led to the horrifying possibility that the Soviets might have actually finished Project Meteor. The Ghost platform wasn't a conceptual relic of the 1960s, it was a silent, perpetually flying reality, now loitering above the Arctic, waiting. Second came the Ghost platform, the terrifying reality of the long-forgotten Project Meteor. This large, disc-shaped craft loitered silently at the brutal altitude of 80,000 feet over the Arctic, invisible to radar thanks to its advanced ceramic composites and a subtle plasma stealth effect generated by its massive, superconducting magnetic field. Its existence was confirmed by a faint thermal shadow and, chillingly, by the fate of the Norwegian trawler Fjordfangst, whose electronics were surgically microwave cauterized by an experimental weapon test emanating from the platform. The Ghost platform was a vessel of perpetual flight, relying on magnetohydrodynamic (MHD) propulsion and atmospheric plasma tapping, a clear sign of a technological leap the West could not comprehend. The two systems were clearly symbiotic. The Bear Hunter provided the far-seeing eyes, and the Ghost platform provided the silent, untouchable hand, a command relay and a potential hypersonic missile carrier. The West's desperate projects, Goliath and Vulture, struggled to find a countermeasure or even a clean photograph of the Phantom. Then, fate intervened with a moment of pure, unpredictable chance, delivering the physical evidence that would confirm NATO's worst fears. The Arctic weather, the very domain the Soviets sought to conquer with the Ghost platform, became NATO's unlikely ally. The incident occurred in March 1978. The region was still gripped by deep, severe winter, with temperatures plummeting and visibility dropping to near zero. A Soviet Antonov An-12 Cub military transport, flying a standard but highly sensitive logistics route from the nuclear testing grounds of Novaya Zemlya to a mainland maintenance facility, encountered a failure. Icing, combined with a rare synchronous failure in two of its 4 turboprop engines, forced the pilot to declare a dire emergency. With limited options and rapidly decreasing altitude, the Soviet pilot made a desperate, unauthorized descent into the nearest suitable airfield, Rovaniemi Airport, Finland. Finland, officially neutral but geographically pinned between the two superpowers, maintained a delicate political balance. Its intelligence services, the Suojelupoliisi (SUPO), were masters of quiet observation, forever attuned to the strategic dance between East and West. The moment the Soviet transport touched down, the diplomatic pressure began. The crates aboard the plane were immediately identified as sealed, heavily guarded cargo. A large detachment of Soviet embassy personnel, accompanied by military attachés and a highly strung KGB officer, arrived within hours from Helsinki, demanding the plane and its cargo be returned immediately under the guise of national security emergency. The Finns, bound by international aviation protocols but fiercely protective of their sovereignty, agreed to secure the cargo but insisted on a thorough, protocol-mandated inspection of the plane's manifest and contents before release. This was the thin, legal window of opportunity that Western intelligence desperately needed. The breaching of the seal. The Finnish intelligence community moved with quiet, surgical precision. Understanding the extraordinary nature of the diplomatic panic, the Soviets were using language usually reserved for lost nuclear components, they knew the cargo was significant. Under the cover of a lengthy, bureaucratic, customs inventory, a small team of supo-technical experts, accompanied by a seasoned Finnish physicist with deep ties to Western academia, were given authorization to open a single crate. The crate they chose was the heaviest, braced with more than twice the required number of steel bands, and marked with a specific, opaque classification stamp, Component S17A, Arctic Environmental Stress Testing. When the steel bands were cut and the heavy, insulated lid was finally prized open, the Finns were confronted by a sight that transcended standard military hardware. Inside was a cylindrical component the size of a large, double-door refrigerator. It was shrouded in a complex layering of exotic, dull gray ceramic shielding and what appeared to be custom-milled titanium-vanadium alloys. There were no wires dangling, no exposed circuit boards, only a dense, hermetically sealed mass of material and subtle, intricate cooling fins. The Finnish team took a rapid series of high-resolution photographs, detailed measurements, and a tiny, almost microscopic core sample of the external shielding material, all within a tense, 40-minute window before the Soviet delegation's protests became too intense to ignore. The crate was then resealed. The physical evidence was covertly rushed out of Rovaniemi and into the hands of a waiting CIA technical liaison in Stockholm, who immediately relayed the data package to the analysts at the Pentagon. The immediate reaction from the American engineers and physicists who received the Finnish data was a collective, stunned silence, followed by an intake of breath that sounded less like recognition and more like fear. Dr. Howard Klein, the chief electromagnetic engineer for Project Goliath, was one of the first to analyze the material composition and internal structural layout extrapolated from the external cooling architecture and density readings. "This isn't aircraft hardware," Klein muttered, running his hand over a simulated 3D projection of the core's cross-section. "It's too dense. The alloy is too custom, too specialized. And the shielding, it's designed to isolate massive, instantaneous heat fluctuation." The key to the device lay in the core sample of the shielding. It contained trace amounts of highly pure bismuth telluride and a novel, ultra-stable heavy rare earth ceramic. This combination pointed to one, and only one, application: thermoelectric conversion. What NATO analysts were looking at was a thermoelectric resonant core (TRC), a device theorized only in the most obscure, classified Western labs as a theoretical, wish list, power solution, deemed physically impractical due to material science constraints. The loophole in physics. The concept of the TRC was based on the Seebeck effect, the principle that a temperature difference between two dissimilar electrical conductors or semiconductors can produce a voltage. This is the basis of thermocouples. The Soviet design took this principle and amplified it to an almost absurd extreme. The core was not a battery, and it was not a conventional reactor. It was a generator capable of converting small temperature differentials directly into gigawatt-scale pulses through an internal, highly regulated resonant frequency cycling process. But what provided the temperature differential? The core was designed to function in two environments simultaneously: extreme cold, the -50 degrees Celsius of the stratosphere, and intense, localized heat, the internal heat generated by the superconducting magnets and the energy collection process of the plasma taps. The mechanism. The TRC would draw upon the vast, constant temperature gradient between the outside stratospheric cold and the internally generated operational heat. This small, constant differential was then fed into the highly specialized semiconductor matrix. The output. Instead of simply producing a trickle of power, the Soviet design used a revolutionary electromagnetic resonance cascade to take that slow, constant input and compress it into massive, instantaneous bursts of electrical power, gigawatt-scale pulses, that could be released in a controlled fashion. This was the solution to the Ghost platform's perpetual motion problem. It provided the colossal, instantaneous power needed for MHD thrust, the sudden, enormous power bursts required to ionize the air and accelerate the plasma for directional control and altitude maintenance. Microwave emitter. The brief, massive power surge needed to fire the high-power microwave beam that cauterized the Fjordfangst's radio antennae. The TRC proved that the Ghost platform was not running on a small, conventional nuclear reactor, which would require constant refueling and leave a massive heat signature. It was running on the physics of temperature difference, constantly recharging itself by flying in the stratospheric cold. The American analysts, many of whom had dismissed the feasibility of such a device in their own research, realized they were looking at the impossible. If the Soviets built this, they found a loophole in physics we didn't think was real. This cylindrical core, smuggled out of Finland, was the beating heart of the Ghost platform. It was a technology decades ahead of anything NATO believed possible, a realization of exotic physics that rendered the limitations of fuel and endurance obsolete. The final piece of the puzzle, the component that transformed the panic into existential dread, came from the translation of an internal Soviet document. Tucked away in a small, shielded compartment of the crate, a clear violation of the Soviet handler's hasty packing protocols, was a heavily coded but ultimately decipherable logistics tag, an inventory sheet listing the component and its destination. The final, high-security clearance translation, delivered to the CIA director in a locked briefing room, contained the title that would redefine the scope of the threat. Meteor-2, Autonomous Stratospheric Relay System. Deployment Unit Number 14. The name itself was a revelation. It confirmed the Western codename, Project Meteor, was correct, but it added a new layer of terrifying specificity, Meteor-2. This implied a fully operational, second-generation system, past the prototype stage. But the most crushing detail lay in the inventory number, Unit Number 14. The immediate, inescapable, and mathematically certain deduction was made by the chief logistics analyst for SACLANT. Unit 14, which meant there were at least 13 more. The Ghost platform was not a solitary prototype, a one-off experiment the Soviets had poured all their resources into. It was an operational fleet. The strategic implications were staggering. Global coverage. A fleet of 14 or more Ghost platforms, flying their perpetual, high-altitude polar routes, could provide continuous, overlapping reconnaissance and strike coverage across the entire North American and European theater. Decapitation strike capability. The threat of a first strike was no longer theoretical. If 14 Meteor 2 units were simultaneously activated as carriers for hypersonic gliders, they could launch a coordinated, high-speed, minimal warning attack on every key command, communication, and nuclear retaliatory target in the West. The scale of deception. The Soviet effort had not been a localized physics project, it had been a massive, national-scale industrial effort, sustained over years, all while the West was meticulously fed the disinformation by agents like Professor Volkov, ensuring NATO believed such technology was impossible. The discovery of the TRC component and the Unit Number 14 tag proved two things to NATO beyond any doubt. The threat was real, physical, and operational. The scale of the Soviet technological leap was far greater than anyone had dared to imagine. The simple, silent cylindrical core, resting in a Finnish customs warehouse for a few brief hours, had provided the key to the ultimate Soviet weapon, a network of silent, untouchable platforms capable of waging an unseen war from the thin air, powered by a thermoelectric resonant core that defied the known limits of physics. The Cold War had just entered a frightening, new, and truly invisible dimension. For months, the Pulse 62 had been treated as the electronic voice of the Bear Hunter, a colossal radar blast designed to scan the skies. The analysis, rooted in the aggressive mindsets of electronic warfare, assumed the Pulse was an attack system. However, after the discovery of the TRC and the realization that the Ghost platform was a continuous, self-powered entity, the perspective shifted. A massive, high-power OTH radar like the Bear Hunter would require a rapid, continuous stream of high-energy bursts to paint an accurate target picture. The 62-second rhythm was too slow for real-time engagement radar. The breakthrough came when American analysts, led by Dr. Eleanor Vance, stopped focusing on the power of the signal and started focusing on its precision and periodicity. They began to compare the signature of the PULSE-62 with the electronic libraries of their own deep space probes and geosynchronous satellites. These devices, positioned far from Earth, use precisely timed radio pulses, navigation beacons, to maintain stable orientation, correct for minor gravitational drag, and keep their main mission antennae perfectly aimed. The comparison was uncanny. The Pulse 62 wasn't the jagged, rapid blast of an attack radar, it was the smooth, geometrically perfect pulse of a stabilization reference. The analysts concluded. The pulses detected by NATO radars weren't random, they were navigation beacons, the same type used by satellites to stabilize orbit. The implication was profound. The Bear Hunter wasn't using the Pulse 62 to track NATO targets, the Bear Hunter was the ground transmitter providing the Ghost platform with the ultra-stable, global reference signal needed to hold its impossible altitude and position against the subtle, chaotic forces of the upper atmosphere. The Ghost platform was a machine of exquisite delicacy. To draw power from temperature gradients and maintain propulsion with a superconducting magnetic field, it required an almost perfect, continuous knowledge of its altitude, pitch, and yaw. The Pulse 62 was its umbilical cord to ground stability, providing the metronome needed to coordinate the firing of its massive TRC power bursts and the subtle movements of its MHD thrusters. The realization settled like a weight of lead on the command structure. The enemy's most feared electronic weapon was, in fact, the necessary electronic life support for the enemy's most feared physical weapon. It wasn't firing at us, Dr. Vance explained in a subsequent briefing. It was firing for them. The Bear Hunter was simply telling the Meteor, "You are stable now. Hold position." The final Vulture gambit, with the location of the Ghost platform narrowed down to the intersection of the thermal smear and the most stable reception point of the PULSE-62, Project Vulture prepared for its final, crucial gambit, the definitive, visual intercept. The challenge remained the Meteor's altitude and its near-perfect stealth. The State Route 71 had failed to see it, and conventional radar couldn't penetrate the plasma stealth envelope. They needed a non-radar observation platform. NATO deployed a highly modified E-3 Sentry AWACS aircraft. The E-3, normally a flying command post, was chosen for its high-altitude operating ceiling, around 40,000 feet, and its vast internal capacity for experimental equipment. The key piece of technology bolted beneath the fuselage was an experimental high-altitude lidar array, light detection and ranging. Unlike radar, which uses radio waves, lidar uses finely tuned laser pulses to measure distance and shape. The experimental system, housed in a custom pod, was designed to fire high-power, ultraviolet laser pulses upward and analyze the faint scatter returns. The objective of the lidar was not to penetrate the stealth, but to use the thermal shimmer itself as a target. The heat mirage that the keyhole satellites had picked up indicated the presence of highly turbulent, heated air surrounding the platform. The lidar was tuned to detect density changes in that turbulence, to see the displacement of air caused by the enormous, invisible object. On a freezing night in April 1978, the modified E-3, code-named Vulture 7, flew its pattern over the Kara Sea. The stakes were monumental. This was the last chance to get a concrete reading before the Soviets realized their Pulse 62 was compromised and changed its frequency. Inside the cramped sensor bay of the E-3, the scientists watched the lidar screen. For hours, only the standard returns of high-altitude aerosols and ice crystals painted the screen. Then, the signature began to change. The lidar, piercing the 40,000-foot gap between the E-3 and the Meteor, began to register a massive, structured distortion in the atmosphere. The cinematic reveal, when the computer algorithms finally filtered the noise and constructed a recognizable, three-dimensional outline from the laser returns, the American and British engineers who had spent months chasing a ghost gasped in horrified recognition. For the first time, they saw it. It was gigantic, far larger than any previous analysis had dared to speculate. The outline was a blunted oval, a smooth, terrifyingly efficient shape, a pure machine defined by its function. The lidar returns showed a wingless construct the length of a modern American football field, easily over 100 meters, 330 feet. The sheer scale of the machine meant that Captain Harris' description of something large blocked the stars was not an exaggeration, it was an understatement. It was shimmering like a heat mirage, the thermal energy required for the TRC and the MHD thrusters creating a visible atmospheric turbulence around the vast hull, even at that extreme distance. It was almost perfectly invisible, not just to radar, but to the naked eye, a phantom drifting effortlessly at an unbelievable 95,000 feet, far above the ceiling of even the highest flying MiG-25R or the fastest SR-71. The most critical observation confirmed the physics of the perpetual engine. It had no engines. There were no jet intakes, no propeller wash, and no discernible exhaust ports, only the smooth, seamless ceramic curvature of the hull. No control surfaces, no ailerons, flaps, or rudders were visible. The platform relied entirely on the superconducting magnetic manipulation of the plasma thrusters for its yaw and pitch adjustments. Instead of engines, the lidar showed the surface of the hull was covered in panels, thousands of them, arranged in intricate, fractal patterns. These panels were constantly shifting, making minute, coordinated adjustments, like scales on a massive, slow-moving reptile. The machine that rode the air. The discovery of the shifting panels finally completed the picture of the ghost platform's true power source. It was a machine powered by the very planet itself. The panels were not solar photovoltaic cells, they were thermal collection arrays. They were the external face of the thermoelectric resonant core (TRC) recovered in Finland. The entire 300-foot-long platform functioned as a massive, airborne energy collector. It was designed to constantly, passively, and silently harvest thermal radiation and temperature differentials from every conceivable source: sunlight, direct solar heating on one side of the platform, thermal radiation from Earth, the faint, infrared heat rising from the land and ocean far below, stratospheric gradient, the massive, constant temperature differential between the warm side of the TRC internal operation and the side exposed to the brutal -50 degrees Celsius of the upper atmosphere. The machine literally rode temperature gradients like sails catching the wind, using the shifting heat flows to constantly replenish the power compressed by the TRC. The thousands of panels constantly shifted to optimize this collection, maximizing the temperature difference and efficiently feeding energy into the core. A machine that could stay aloft forever. The implications for surveillance and communication were absolute. A platform that never needed to land, never needed to refuel, and was invisible to conventional radar could maintain an absolute, permanent electronic and photographic vigil over any point on Earth. For nuclear command and control, it meant the Soviets had a communications relay that was literally untouchable, guaranteeing a retaliatory strike could be ordered even if ground command centers were annihilated. NATO commanders stared at the litter footage, silent. The sheer scale and elegance of the design were terrifying. It was a technological masterpiece built for total strategic dominance. The year 1978 marked the zenith of NATO's terror. They had identified a colossal, invisible strategic weapon, the Ghost platform, the operational Meteor-2 Project Meteor. This perpetual flight machine, the length of a football field, cruised silently at 95,000 feet, powered by a revolutionary thermoelectric resonant core (TRC) that harvested atmospheric temperature gradients. Its navigational umbilical cord was the rhythmic Pulse 62 from the colossal Bear Hunter radar in Kazakhstan. NATO had confirmed the existence of at least 14 such units, a silent, untouchable fleet poised for global surveillance and nuclear decapitation strikes via hypersonic gliders. The physical nature of the platform, finally revealed by experimental litter on a modified E-3 Sentry, confirmed its invisibility was due to advanced ceramics and a plasma stealth field generated by its magnetohydrodynamic (MHD) thrusters. The question that haunted the commanders of Project Vulture and Goliath was why the Soviets were holding back, leading to the grim conclusion that the machine was either unfinished or, more terrifyingly, out of control. Just as NATO began the agonizing, 5-year development cycle for Project Thor, the counter-physics weapon designed to overload the TRC with a resonant electromagnetic pulse, the entire, fragile structure of this electronic siege collapsed. The end did not come with a bang, but with a sudden, absolute, electronic silence. It was May 1978. The spring melt was transforming the Arctic landscape, but in the sterile, low-lit operations rooms of RAF Fillingdales, where the Pulse 62 was first detected, the atmosphere was one of strained vigilance. Analysts had grown accustomed to the metronomic rhythm, the 62-second throb that had become the sonic symbol of Soviet technological superiority. At precisely 4:11 Zulu, the pulse simply stopped. The chief on duty, Commander Ian Halstead, initially suspected a malfunction in the monitoring equipment itself, a tripped breaker, a failed sensor array. The rhythm was so predictable that its absence felt like a physical shock. Teams were immediately dispatched to check the BMEWS array, convinced the problem was internal. But the silence was global. From the listening post in Gander, Newfoundland, to the ELINT stations in Siberian outposts operated by proxies, the Pulse 62 vanished simultaneously. The Bear Hunter had gone dark. Concurrently, the surveillance screens at Fort Meade tracking the faint thermal smear of the Ghost platform went cold. The heat signature disappeared. The massive machine, which had been generating enough heat to be detected by satellites 500 miles above, was suddenly radiating no more thermal energy than the surrounding stratosphere. The NRO analysts, poring over the latest keyhole satellite passes, confirmed the optical void. The object no longer blocked starlight. The geometric shadow that Captain Harris had observed from the cockpit of the State Route 71 was gone. The ghost platform had vanished without a trace, taking the rhythmic heartbeat of the bear hunter with it. The three theories of disappearance. The intelligence community immediately split into three camps, each theory rooted in the observer's prior assessment of Soviet capability. Theory A. The retreat, the political explanation. The most conservative analysts, mostly the old guard at the State Department and CIA Directorate of Operations, believed the Soviets had simply retreated. Hypothesis. The intense, high-altitude surveillance missions by the SR-71s and the deployment of the modified E-3 with the Litter Array, though covert, had convinced the Kremlin that the Meteor II was compromised. Conclusion. The Soviet leadership, fearing the platform's advanced technology might fall into NATO hands through an accidental failure, ordered the fleet to drift passively into secure Soviet airspace deep over the Asian landmass, effectively hiding the technology for further maintenance or modification. The bear hunter was shut down to deny NATO the stabilization frequency. Theory B. The catastrophe, the engineering explanation. Engineers and scientists. The analysts from Project Goliath who understood the fragility of the TRC and the MHD systems, were convinced of a massive, structural failure. Hypothesis. The perpetual flight system had failed. The thermoelectric resonant core may have suffered a critical material breakdown, or the high-G maneuvers necessary to evade the SR-71s had compromised the superconducting magnets, leading to a catastrophic loss of MHD thrust. Conclusion. The vast, heavy platform, losing all means of propulsion, had become an immense, unguided glider. It simply failed and fell into the Arctic Ocean, likely disintegrating upon hitting the dense lower atmosphere. The freezing water of the Kara Sea, a Soviet dumping ground, offered a massive, silent grave, ensuring no debris would ever be recovered by the West. Theory C. The ascension, the impossible explanation. This was the theory held by the physicists like Dr. Eleanor Vance and the technical analysts of the NRO, the people who had seen the Litter images and decoded the TRC. They knew the fundamental truth about the ghost platform: it was designed to break the rules. Hypothesis. The disappearance was not a political retreat or a technical failure, but a deliberate, high-speed maneuver that exceeded all known atmospheric flight capabilities. The abrupt silence suggested an intentional power shift, not a power loss. The final signal burst. Vertical acceleration. The most compelling and frightening evidence supporting the ascension theory came not from the silence, but from a fractional second of intense, last-ditch electronic activity. The RC-135 Rivet Joint Electronic Reconnaissance Aircraft, still orbiting the Barents Sea on a routine patrol, happened to be recording the ambient radio spectrum when the silence hit. Its high-speed telemetry recorders captured a microscopic, millisecond-long burst of non-standard, encrypted Soviet data immediately preceding the total cessation of the PULSE-62. The classified CIA memo that circulated among the highest echelons of NATO command detailed the analysis of this single, final electronic scream. Final signal burst indicates vertical acceleration beyond 3,000 meters per second. Possible atmospheric exit trajectory, 3,000 meters per second. That is over Mach 8.8, nearly 9 times the speed of sound, and roughly 10 times faster than the highest speed the State Route 71 could maintain. More importantly, this acceleration was recorded along the vertical axis. To achieve such an instantaneous burst of vertical velocity in the dense atmosphere would require an application of energy that was not just huge, but instantaneous and perfectly controlled. Only the thermoelectric resonant core (TRC), with its ability to compress and release gigawatt-scale power in a shaped pulse, could achieve such a feat. The conclusion was inescapable. The Soviet command, or perhaps the ghost platform's autonomous failsafe, had intentionally redirected all the massive power harvested and compressed by the TRC into the MHD thrusters for a single, colossal vertical thrust. In other words, the device left the atmosphere. The ghost platform, the massive, wingless construct, had not failed. It had achieved escape velocity and pushed itself beyond the thin atmospheric envelope, into the vacuum of space, using the immense, instantaneous force of its TRC-powered MHD drive. This explained the sudden silence. Once the platform left the ionosphere, the bear hunter's stabilization signal, reliant on the Earth ionosphere waveguide, would become useless. The platform would shift to its own, high-altitude navigational system. It was now a Soviet satellite, A gigantic, stealth, perpetual motion satellite, completely outside the reach of any 1970s countermeasure. The aftermath and the enduring mystery. The ghost platform was gone. No debris was ever found. The Arctic was meticulously swept by NATO intelligence assets. Submarines listened for crash debris, high-altitude aircraft scanned for thermal traces, but the silence was absolute. If the platform had disintegrated, the materials science of the TRC and the ceramic hull suggested there would have been highly identifiable traces. There were none. In the Soviet Union, the disappearance was treated with an equal, terrifying silence. No Soviet statement was ever issued. The KGB arrested dozens of engineers connected to Project Meteor under the pretense of negligence, but the platform's designer, Dr. Zhuravlev, vanished into the shadows of the Soviet scientific Gulag system. Project Meteor was formally shut down in 1981 without explanation. Western intelligence concluded that the Soviets had failed to master the final phase of the TRC technology, its controlled deacceleration and re-entry, and had chosen to cut their losses and bury the embarrassing failure. Yet, the nagging data, the Mach 8.8 vertical acceleration, remained the unassailable truth in the classified vaults of the CIA. To this day, the legacy of the device NATO discovered in 1977 remains a subject of intense, often grim, speculation among the aging men and women who fought the technological war from the shadows. Was it a failed Soviet experiment? Did the complexity of the TRC doom the fleet, leaving Unit 14 to disintegrate harmlessly in the void? A runaway autonomous aircraft? Did the failsafe system trigger itself, casting the massive machine out of the atmosphere, leaving it to drift endlessly as a silent, unguided ghost? A technological breakthrough buried by the collapse of the USSR? Did the Soviets achieve stable, high-altitude, stealth orbit, only for the economic and political collapse of the 1980s to prevent the replication of the fleet, leaving the technology to decay in some remote archive? The most chilling possibility, the one that kept the creators of Project Thor awake at night, was that the Ghost platform had achieved its ultimate, intended purpose, to become the ultimate, permanent autonomous stratospheric relay system. That the Meteor-2, the massive, wingless machine built to harvest power from the planet, still floats silently above the world, in the thin, frozen darkness where airplanes cannot fly. It is a technological specter, waiting for a remote signal to reactivate its thermoelectric resonant core and redirect its colossal power for a new mission.